The tomato. Nothing separates a beginner's garden from a beginner's second season quite like the tomato, a plant forgiving enough to fruit reliably yet demanding enough to punish sloppy watering habits almost immediately. Staking or caging is required from the moment of planting, since indeterminate varieties can climb well past head height and collapse under their own fruit weight without support. While consistent watering, roughly 1 to 2 inches per week delivered deeply rather than in frequent light sprinkles, becomes essential the moment fruit begins to form. Skip that consistency, and the plant develops blossom end rot, a dark, sunken, leathery patch on the fruit's underside caused not by a lack of calcium in the soil, but by the plant's inability to move that calcium properly during uneven watering cycles. Full sun for 6 to 8 hours a day is non-negotiable, and the plant also needs its lower leaves pruned away from the soil line to reduce fungal disease splashing up during rain, a small but recurring maintenance task absent from true beginner crops. Get the watering rhythm right though, and a single healthy plant can produce fruit continuously from midsummer through the first frost, rewarding the extra attention with one of the most productive harvests available from any single plant in the garden. Soil pH also matters more here than for most crops, since tomatoes prefer a slightly acidic range and struggle to take up calcium properly outside that window, adding yet another variable a beginner has to track beyond simply remembering to water on schedule. The bell pepper. Slower to establish than most vegetables on this list, bell peppers demand patience before they demand skill, often sitting in the ground looking barely changed for several weeks while their root systems quietly develop underground. Consistent soil moisture matters just as much here as it does for tomatoes, and the same calcium-related blossom end rot can strike peppers left to dry out between waterings, appearing as the identical sunken, discolored patch near the fruit's base. Unlike tomatoes, peppers rarely need staking early on, but heavily loaded plants late in the season often benefit from a simple stake or cage once the weight of multiple ripening fruits starts to bend otherwise sturdy stems. Bell peppers also need consistently warm soil to truly take off, generally refusing to grow much at all until nighttime temperatures stay reliably above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which means an impatient early planting often just stalls rather than actually failing outright. Every entry in this difficulty series builds directly on the last, and Garden's Lab is tracking the full climb from impossible to kill through nearly impossible to grow, with the next level arriving every few days for anyone moving up the ladder one crop at a time. Harvesting a pepper green rather than waiting for it to ripen to red, orange, or yellow also encourages the plant to keep setting new fruit rather than slowing production once a few peppers reach full maturity. The onion. Bulb formation in onions runs almost entirely on day length rather than temperature, meaning the wrong variety planted in the wrong region can grow lush green tops all season and still fail to form a usable bulb at all. Long day varieties need roughly 14 to 16 hours of summer daylight to trigger bulbing and belong in northern regions, while short day varieties suited to southern latitudes need only 10 to 12 hours. A distinction that trips up plenty of gardeners who simply grab whatever seed packet is available locally without checking the type. Onions also compete poorly against weeds thanks to a shallow, sparse root system, so regular, careful weeding throughout the entire growing season becomes necessary in a way it rarely is for deeper-rooted crops that can simply outcompete intruders on their own. The plants are also prone to bolting, sending up a premature flower stalk in response to a cold snap during early growth or overly warm temperatures later on. And once an onion bolts, energy shifts away from bulb formation entirely, permanently limiting the size of the final harvest. Reliable results depend on getting 3 separate variables right at once: the correct daylight type variety, consistent weeding, and stable temperatures during the bulbing window. A level of coordination well beyond anything the impossible to kill tier ever demanded. Onions also take considerably longer to reach harvest than most vegetables on this list, often needing 3 to 4 months in the ground from planting to a fully cured bulb, which stretches out the window during which any one of those variables can quietly go wrong before the mistake ever becomes visible above ground. The beet. Underneath their reputation as a simple root vegetable, beets carry a genuinely fussy relationship with soil moisture that separates a smooth, round harvest from a cracked, woody disappointment. Inconsistent watering during root development causes the roots to crack or grow oddly misshapen, while a dry spell followed by heavy rain often splits a nearly mature beet right down the middle just before harvest. Beet seeds are also technically seed clusters rather than single seeds, meaning several seedlings typically emerge from one planting spot and must be thinned by hand to roughly 3 to 4 inches apart. A fiddly task easy to neglect but essential for developing properly sized roots rather than a tangle of stunted competing plants. Because beets are shallow feeders sensitive to boron deficiency in particular, soil that has never been tested can quietly produce beets with a tough, corky black core hidden beneath an otherwise healthy-looking exterior. Both the root and the leafy green top are edible, and while the greens forgive plenty of beginner mistakes on their own, coaxing a genuinely well-formed root out of the ground demands the exact kind of steady, attentive moisture management that pushes this crop firmly out of the impossible-to-kill category, the spinach. Spinach germinates and grows quickly, but its shallow, delicate root system leaves almost no margin for inconsistent watering, and even a single missed watering during a warm stretch is often enough to trigger premature bolting. Once a spinach plant sends up its flowering stalk, the leaves turn sharply bitter almost overnight, meaning a moment of neglect can undo weeks of otherwise careful growing in a single afternoon. The plant strongly prefers cool weather, ideally rising no higher than the mid-70s, and pushing a summer planting into real heat all but guarantees a rushed bolt regardless of how carefully the soil is watered. Seedlings also transplant poorly compared to most other leafy greens, developing a taproot that resents disturbance, which generally means direct sowing into the garden bed rather than starting plants indoors and moving them later. Mulching around established plants helps retain the steady soil moisture spinach depends on, but the underlying challenge never fully disappears, since this crop essentially demands the same kind of unbroken watering discipline as a tomato, while offering none of the visible warning signs that make a wilting tomato leaf so easy to notice and correct in time. Harvesting the outer leaves regularly rather than waiting for a single large cutting also helps the plant stay productive longer before the inevitable shift toward flowering finally begins. The cabbage. Cabbage takes considerably longer to reach harvest than most vegetables on this list, often needing 2 to 3 months of steady, uninterrupted growth to form a solid, tightly wrapped head, and that extended timeline creates a much longer window for problems to take hold. Cabbage worms, loopers, and root maggots all target this crop specifically, often requiring floating row covers or regular hands-on inspection to catch infestations before they shred through developing leaves, a level of pest vigilance well beyond anything the easiest crops ever demand. Inconsistent watering causes heads to split open just as they approach full size, a frustrating way to lose a harvest after months of otherwise successful growth. And the plant's dense, tightly packed structure means that once a head does split, it becomes considerably more vulnerable to rot setting in before it can be harvested. Cabbage also bolts if hit by an unexpected cold snap while still young, sending up a flowering stalk instead of forming a proper head, which means timing the planting correctly relative to the local frost calendar matters just as much as anything that happens once the seeds are actually in the ground. Reaching a firm, healthy, unsplit head by harvest day genuinely requires monitoring the plant regularly across its entire multi-month growing cycle, rather than checking in only occasionally. Spacing also plays a bigger role than many beginners expect, since crowding plants too closely restricts head size and airflow, creating exactly the damp, still conditions that fungal diseases and lingering pests both prefer. The cucumber. Cucumbers grow quickly and produce heavily once established, but consistent watering is non-negotiable in a way that separates this crop clearly from the truly beginner-proof tier. Uneven moisture is the single most common cause of bitter-tasting fruit and misshapen cucumbers, since the plant's rapid growth rate leaves almost no buffer for a missed watering during a hot stretch. Training the sprawling vines up a trellis rather than letting them spread across bare soil helps keep developing fruit clean and easy to spot. But it also adds an ongoing maintenance task that the truly hands-off crops never require in the first place. Harvesting also demands real attention, since cucumbers left on the vine even a few days past their prime quickly balloon into oversized, seedy, tough-skinned fruit. And that overripe fruit sitting on the vine actively signals the plant to slow down further production. Modern burpless and pickling varieties have been bred to resist bitterness better than older types, offering a small cushion for beginners. But the underlying need for steady, attentive watering throughout the entire growing season remains the same regardless of variety. The potato. Potatoes reward patience with an entire season's worth of buried treasure. But getting there requires considerably more active management than simply dropping a seed in the ground and walking away. The hilling method demands repeated attention throughout the growing season, mounding soil up around the base of the plant every few weeks to keep developing tubers covered and protected from sunlight, since any potato exposed to light turns green and develops solanine, a compound that makes the tuber bitter and mildly toxic. Potatoes also need noticeably more fertilizer than most garden vegetables, with extension experts recommending a side dressing of nitrogen applied directly alongside the row roughly a month after planting, and again 2 weeks later, a level of ongoing feeding well beyond the needs of the easiest crops. Consistent moisture matters throughout tuber development, since drought stress followed by heavy watering can cause the tubers to crack or grow strange, knobby secondary growths, and soil that stays too wet for too long invites rotten disease directly into the developing crop. The reward for managing all of that, hilling, fertilizing, and steady watering, is a harvest of tubers that store for months after digging, but reaching that point takes a level of hands-on involvement that puts potatoes solidly into easy, rather than truly hands-off territory. Soil that stays loose and well-drained throughout the season also matters more here than for most root vegetables, since compacted ground restricts tuber expansion and can leave a plant that looked perfectly healthy above ground, producing a disappointingly small harvest underneath.